moving on to lesson 5.6, part 1. Okay, solving an absolute value equation. So there are 3 steps to solving an absolute value equation. The first step is to isolate the absolute value symbols. In other words, you're kind of treating the symbols, the absolute value symbols, like variables. Okay, you're treating them as if it's something that you want to isolate. You want to get them by themselves. Step 2, set up 2 equations. 1 positive, 1 negative. Step 3, solve and check both. So you're going to solve and you are going to check both answers. We're going to start off with a simple problem. We're going to start off with number 3. We're going to follow the steps that we just wrote. Step 1 is to isolate the absolute value symbol. Well, if you notice, these are my absolute value symbols. There is nothing on the outside of my absolute value symbols that needs to allow me to isolate it. So then I'm going to set up my 2 equations. When you set up your 2 equations, you need to drop your absolute value signs. So this is going to become n minus 4 equals 2 and n minus 4 equals negative 2. So step 1, isolate your absolute value symbols. Well, in this case, they were already isolated. Step 2, drop those absolute value symbols and set up your 2 equations, 1 positive and 1 negative. Step 3 is to solve and check both answers. So we have n minus 4 equals 2. Let's solve this one first. Add 4, and we get n is equal to 6. Add 4 over here, and we get n is equal to 2. You are always going to end up with 2 answers when you're solving an absolute value equation. These 2 answers might not both work. We have to check for what's called extraneous solutions. If a solution does not work, if a solution does not work, it's called an extraneous solution. And that spelling is probably not right, and I apologize right now. So back down to number 3, we need to check to make sure that these answers work. And how do we check to make sure these answers work? Plugging them into the original equation. So I'm going to start with 6. We have the absolute value of 6 minus 4 equals 2. When you're simplifying, always simplify inside the absolute value symbols first. Always simplify what's inside the absolute value symbols first. What is 6 minus 4? It is 2. What is the absolute value of 2? It's 2. 2 equals 2, so n equals 6 is going to work. Moving on to the second answer and checking this one. We have the absolute value of 2 minus 4 equals 2. Well, what is 2 minus 4? Remember, you always simplify inside the absolute value symbols first. 2 minus 4 is negative 2. But what is the absolute value of negative 2? Remember, absolute value means the distance from 0. So the absolute value of negative 2 It's 2 units from 0. So 2 equals 2, and we are good on n equals 2. Let's go ahead and flip our page and look at number 11. So number 11, remember, step 1 is to isolate the absolute value symbols. And this is what I was talking about here. Notice how we have these absolute value symbols here. But what's happening to the absolute value symbols? There's some stuff on the outside of it. We want to get rid of that. We want to get that absolute value by itself so we can set up our 2 different equations. So let's go ahead and isolate that absolute value symbol. Well, what's happening to it? I see that it's being multiplied by 2. Okay, I'm treating my absolute value symbols and what's inside as a variable. I don't really care what's in here at this point. I'm treating this little box as if it's a variable. So multiplied by 2, then added by 6. So first thing I'm going to do is subtract 6. And I get 2 times the absolute value of 4s. Again, I really don't care what's inside here, but I'm still going to rewrite it. Equals 8. Then from here, I still have not isolated my absolute value symbols. I divide by 2 to both sides. And I get the absolute value of 4s equals 4. Now, I have isolated my absolute value symbols. I can set up my 2 different equations. So I have 4s equals 4 and 4s equals negative 4. Now to solve each equation. Divide by 4, and I get s is equal to 1. Divide by 4, and I get s is equal to negative 1. I am not done with this problem, even though it looks like I am, because I need to always check. I need to check and make sure that the answers I found work, because if they do not work, one of them could be considered an extraneous solution. So let's check by plugging it into the original. So we will start with 1. 2 times the absolute value of 4 times 1 plus 6 equals 14. We'll simplify what's inside the absolute value first. 4 times 1 is 4. And what is the absolute value of 4? Well, that's just 4. In between there and there is always going to be multiplication. So we have 8 plus 6, and looks like we're going to be correct. 14 is going to equal 14. Moving on to the next check. 2 times the absolute value of 4 times negative 1 plus 6 equals 14. Well, simplify what's inside the absolute value first. What is 4 times negative 1? It's negative 4. What is the absolute value now of negative 4? Remember, the absolute value is the distance from 0, and it's 4 units from 0. If I were to keep simplifying, I would get 8 plus 6 is equal to 14, which again is going to work. So therefore, my answers, s equals 1 and s equals negative 1, are going to work.